Hi everyone, welcome. We're just going to take a few seconds while everyone is joining in. While you wait, everyone, especially our speakers and our co-chairs and organizers, you're very welcome to introduce yourself in the chat box. I encourage you to share your name and your organization and where you're joining us from. And since we are at time, I think we're going to start this event. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening for wherever you're joining us from. Today's event, the Spotlight on USAID's Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Policy Opportunities for Action, is hosted by the Policy and Learning Work Group. And you'll hear from one of the co-chairs in a little bit as well. So a little bit about SID United States, if you're not familiar with us and you're new to our events. We are the largest and the most active chapter of the Society for International Development, SID, which is an international network founded in 1957, to serve as a global forum dedicated to sustainable economic, social, and political development. We serve as a global town square for the international development community, bringing together people from diverse organizations, disciplines, and career stages in a neutral, independent forum to share information and discuss important issues and challenges facing our community, as we are doing today. There are different ways that you can get involved with us. You can check out some of our upcoming events and sign up for a weekly newsletter. Follow the link in the chat box, or you can go to www.sid-us.org. You can apply to be a volunteer co-chair or a work group or network associate, as we have Amy and Sam here today. Or you can follow us on social media and stay in touch with all of our different activities. A few things to note for today's event. This is a recorded session and it will be shared publicly through our network and our social media channels. You can find a recording of this event on YouTube very shortly after the event, and closed captioning is available and can be accessed through your own individual settings. If you have any questions for any of our speakers, please specify if it's a specific speaker and you can post them in the chat box. Please note if it's for any specific speaker, and we'll try to make sure we answer all questions, but we might not be able to get to all the questions in the interest of time. So apologies for that in advance. Our co-chairs for the Policy and Learning Work Group are Amy Johnson with Encompass LLC and Lindsay Moore with Developmetrics. And we also have our work group associate for the work group here today, Sam Al-Hadef with USAID. And I'm going to let our work group co-chair Amy introduce the speakers, but I will just move over to her slide deck for that. Thank you for being here, and yeah, I hope you enjoy this event. All right, Amy, over to you while I pull up the slide deck.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that warm welcome, Malvika. I'm so excited that everybody is here for this really important conversation around USAID's 2023 Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Policy. I'm Amy Johnson. My pronouns are she, her. I'm Associate Director for Learning and Leadership Development and Gender Equality Inclusive Practices at Encompass. And as Malvika said, I'm one of the co-chairs of the SID-US Policy and Learning Work Group. I want to acknowledge my co-chair, Lindsay Moore, who's unable to join us today. She's based in Spain and the time differences don't always work out, but she's been a true partner in pulling together all of the events and in really spearheading this work group. And I'm delighted that Sam Al-Hadef, our work group co-chair, work group associate, is here for the event and really supporting us in getting messaging out both before and after the event. The timing of our discussion today comes right on the heels of USAID's Global Gender Conference last week. So I'm really excited to continue that momentum and move things along with this really focused conversation. And one of the things that I appreciate the most about this work group, Policy and Learning, as opposed to some of the ones that focus on specific sectors or topics, is that we can really cover such a wide array. And today, I'm just really delighted to dive deeply into the specific policy for some true learning. And it's not just any policy, but one that is so critical for meaningful development outcomes, USAID's 2023 gender policy. So let me just give you a lay of the land, a flow for how we're going to spend the next hour and 15 minutes together. To get us started, we're going to have an overview of the policy, including changes from the previous version that are relevant, particularly for the global community working with USAID. Then we have two really fantastic speakers who've been at the forefront of implementing the updated gender policy and its foremothers, and they're going to be sharing examples of the policy in action. Our speakers are going to each be leading a breakout session where you will have an opportunity to talk in smaller groups about the policy, ways you're already meeting some of the requirements, questions that you have, and really brainstorm what you can do to continue to address gender inequalities and contribute to positive development outcomes. So before we get started, I wanted to ask for a virtual show of hands of who is familiar with or who has read the policy. You can either type into chat, or if you have the raise hand feature, I see some are already able to find that. Wonderful. It seems like a number of people have it. I'm also seeing that Lindsay Moore is here. So I'm so excited. Thank you, Lindsay. And seeing some familiar names. Oh, hands keep popping up. Wonderful. Okay. So we have some familiarity with it. I want to encourage everyone to dive more deeply into the policy itself and the really great complementary resources that USAID has on its website. And we're going to be sharing a link at the end of the session to all of these. But to get us started, I want to introduce my colleague, Diana Santillan. And Diana's going to be giving us the overview. Diana is a true technical expert in gender, and I am privileged to get to work with her and learn from her on a regular basis in her role as principal advisor for gender equity and inclusive practices at Encompass. For more than 30 years, Diana has worked in a variety of capacities around the globe to advance gender equality and inclusion with a particular emphasis on health. She has a master's degree in women's studies, along with 2 other master's degrees in human sciences and anthropology. Yes, that is 3 master's degrees, all of them from George Washington University. Diana has worked in international organizations, academic settings, and for USAID, where she was most recently the Senior Gender Advisor in the Global Health Bureau's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. Diana contributed to development of both the original 2012 version of the gender policy, as well as the 2023 updates that we'll be talking about today. Diana, over to you for our review.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, Amy, and to the SID-US organizers and to our esteemed speakers that are coming up next. Great to be with you all today. I just wanted to kick us off with a little bit of an overview. I know many of you are already familiar with the 2023 Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Policy. So I'm just going to do very high level, brief overview of the objectives and some of the key changes to keep an eye on. So we can start by going into the objectives. So, and these will seem very familiar to you because the first 3 have not changed from the 2012. So the first one still addresses gender gaps and closing them, and especially, thinking about gender gaps across all sectors. So access and control and benefit from not just economic resources, but also social, political, legal, educational, health, cultural resources, all the opportunities and services and wealth that comes from access and control over and benefit from those resources. So that's the first objective of the policy, still very important in our work. And similarly, number 2, addressing gender-based violence and really striving to eliminate it. So taking it not just to prevention and risk mitigation response, but really with that end goal of how do we create a world free of gender-based violence. The third objective is still focuses on the empowerment of women and girls, because we know that around the world, in many cases, they really are the ones that are feeling most disadvantaged in many situations, in many contexts. And so making sure that there is a focus on them, on making sure that they have, again, also access to all that they need so that they can determine their life outcomes and have agency in their decisions that really guide their lives in all of their households, communities, societies, at all of these levels. And then the fourth one is the new one, and that one takes the work in gender integration to another level, because we don't want just to close the gender gaps. We don't just want to address gender-based violence and empower women and girls, but really get to those deep roots of gender inequality. And that means that we're talking about transformation of gender norms and dynamics and how those intersect with other inequalities. And so the fourth one really asks us to think more deeply about how we do our gender integration work in a way that is going to contribute to this more equitable and inclusive world. So those are the policy objectives. And so I'll go over some of the other key changes in the next slide. Just to give it a moment to switch. There we go. So on the next slide, we see some of the highlights of key changes. The first one is really recognizing that gender equality is a human right. So many reasons to work on gender equality and towards gender equality. And we know the evidence is there that we do better development programming if we address gender inequalities. And we also have the requirement, USAID mandate to work in gender equality, but the policy also recognizes this is a human right. And so there's also that moral imperative to work in this area. There's more inclusive language and framing throughout the policy. So we talk about not only addressing and empowering women and girls and engaging men and boys, but also addressing the inequalities faced by gender diverse individuals. And so you will see that language throughout. And then we have these principles that I'm going to get into a little bit later that really focus in on intersectionality, on localization, and on those transformative approaches that are needed, especially to reach that fourth objective that I just talked about. In the next bullet, you see that also the objectives have been updated. I already covered that. This does reflect this commitment to going to that next level of addressing those root causes. And then these new requirements have greater accountability mechanisms built in alignment with legal requirements. Some of them already appear in the conforming edits that have been made to the ADS 205, the automated directive systems, the rules and regulations of USAID programming. So we have the conforming edits, and there is a working group currently working on the revisions that will really operationalize all of these updates in a deeper way. So in the next slide, we have some more information for you that highlights some key updates. The first one is around gender analysis and a context-specific gender analysis that is needed really to inform activity design. So we know because of the WE Act, the Women's Economic Entrepreneurship Act, that we had to do gender analysis at activity level, but it wasn't always clear or operationalized in USAID policy and ADS 205. So now that clarity is there. That definitely we need an activity level gender analysis, and not just post-award. Post-award is still very important, but we also need one pre-award that's going to inform the solicitation. That's really been the best practice in many ways, but that is now in the policy. And so we have, the larger strategy level gender analysis that guides country programming or programming in Washington bureaus as well. And then there are still some missions that have kind of an in-between gender analysis that's either guiding a program or project level. That used to be the one that was emphasized most, but now also the activity level, pre-award, and then in many cases post-award, because for many solicitations, for many designs, you really don't have especially if it's a cooperative agreement where you're working with others, implementing partners to co-create exactly what that activity will do, you really need some of that information post-award to dive deep into what the gender situation is where you are working. Then we also have mission orders where we have within the policy, there was already this requirement to have a gender mission order, but now there's clarity also that it needs to be updated every 5 years. So that previously there was no timeline, and it really is something that needs to be revisited. And maybe it won't drastically change, but at least revisited every 5 years to take a look and see what does need to be updated, what information gaps there might be, to make sure that the gender mission order is guiding the programming in an accurate way. And then Washington bureaus now have something in parallel to the mission orders that is called the standard operating procedures. And so that is a new requirement. They also need to have an overarching strategy of how not only are they conducting the gender analyses, but how they are taking those findings from the gender analyses and really implementing them in the solicitations and in the activities of the awards. And then missions, regional missions, bureaus, all required to have gender advisors. That was the case before as well, but now there are some LOE requirements around that. So in the past, that was not there. And so sometimes there were gender points of contact, but sometimes they were split between, they were gender points of contact, but also worked on youth issues and inclusion issues and all these and localization issues. And now there's some LOE requirements around the gender integration part of the work that needs to be held for that work. And for depending on the size of the budget of the mission, that could be full-time. And in many cases is. And then we know that the entire workforce has to take the updated Gender 101. That is a publicly available e-course, and so it is strongly recommended that implementing partners also take it so that they're up to date with all of the requirements. And then finally, with the gender advisors and points of contacts, they also are required to take 2 additional courses offered by GenDev, the Office of Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. And so one of them really focuses on integration of gender issues across the program cycle. And then the second course focuses on prevention, risk mitigation, and response of gender-based violence across all sectors. So those 2 are also required so as well for gender advisors and points of contacts in USAID, but also offers other courses for implementing partners at some missions as well. Not required, but best practice as well. So on the next slide, we have some of the key principles, guiding principles that have been added to the policy. And so these are 7 principles that, as I've been saying, take the, excuse me, the gender equality work to the next level. So the first one on integrated approaches, it really recognizes that if we are going to have greater equity, we need not just that sector-specific work and impact, but working across sectors, integrate where it makes sense, especially when you're thinking about addressing gender-based violence. Of course, it's so important that there's coordination across sectors to respond to the needs of survivors. And so integrated captures that type of approach that's an intentional coordination across sectors. Intersectionality, we will hear more about today as well. Really recognizing that we are not just men, women, and gender diverse individuals, but we live our gendered lives in intersection with so many other important social categories, and that there's power and privilege attached to that. So incorporating an intersectional gender lens is really highlighted in this principle, and is supposed to really guide our programming so that we can identify what are the ways that gender intersects with these other inequalities. What are the inequalities that I often like to say, what differences make a difference in the context where you are working, and how are we taking them into account? The next one, transformative, we've been talking about as well. So ensuring that all people, regardless of gender identity, have the opportunity to realize their full potential. That requires that we transform norms, behaviors, relations, structures, systems, all the gender system really that perpetuates the gender inequality. And so taking that transformative approach and being as transformative as possible in the context where you are working, putting in place safeguarding, risk mitigation approaches, because we know that when we're shifting power dynamics, there might be some unintended consequences. We need to keep an eye on those. Locally led reflects the priorities of localization that USAID has been strongly committed to for a long time now, but really is putting more into practice and some ambitious goals around that. And so making sure that when we are working to dismantle these systemic inequalities and address these power imbalances, in the context where we work, that we are putting local actors and organizations in the lead, following their lead, because they know their realities best. And so it's important to do a landscape of what the situation is in terms of local actors and communities and how they interact so that we can work with allies to move this work forward. And then the collaborative is another principle, and that just focuses on this commitment to fostering more flexible, adaptive, creative approaches to engaging both new partners and diverse partners to advance gender equity and equality. So highlights that important way that we co-create these programs, co-create the work that we do to reach all. Accountable has to do with the fact that everyone is responsible for gender equality work, not just gender advisors and points of contacts. So everyone at USAID, certainly from the USAID administrator, senior officials, mission directors, bureau leaders, everyone, to program, technical, human resources, financial management, acquisitions, assistance, staff, everyone, and implementing partners, all of you here, responsible for advancing this gender policy and its objectives, and applying all of these guiding principles through the roles that we play in this work. And then the last one, do no harm. As I mentioned earlier, anytime we're working in this space, we are transforming some deep-rooted, unequal gender norms and dynamics that we need to make sure that we are mitigating any potential unintended consequences of our assistance, of our programming, and that we're not inadvertently harming the people and communities we seek to support and empower. And so that's why it's so crucial that we do those gender analyses, those context-specific analyses, and understand the lay of the land before we work with local actors to make these great changes. So that's my brief overview, very high level of the key changes in the policy. And I am going to hand it back to Amy to introduce our fabulous speakers.
Thank you so much, Deanna. That was really a wonderful walkthrough what we're really going to need for our context for the rest of our discussion. And as you mentioned, we are joined by two really fabulous speakers, and I am just delighted to introduce you to them. Perhaps some of you already know them. So we have Tessie Kuhe and Carolini Ferraz Ignacio. If you haven't met them, let me introduce them briefly. So until very, very recently, Tessie Kuhe was the Gender and Inclusive Development Advisor at USAID Nigeria, where she worked for 20 years. Her technical areas of expertise include gender-based violence, HIV prevention, orphans and vulnerable children, and people with disabilities programming. In addition to her primary role, Tessie co-led USAID Nigeria's diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility efforts, and was part of the Embassy DEIA Council as well. Tessie will speak first, and then she'll be followed by Carolini Ferraz Ignacio, who's the Gender Inclusive Development Advisor with USAID Colombia, where she's worked since 2021. Carolini has also worked as a consultant in Latin America and in Europe as an expert in masculinities and gender equity. In addition to a degree in public health studies from Johns Hopkins, Carolini holds a PhD from the Tropical Medicine Program at Instituto Oswaldo Cruz in Brazil. So they're each going to spend about 5-6 minutes walking through some specifics about the policy in action. Tessie, over to you for our first presentation.
Thank you very much, Amy. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for having me, and thank you for that very gracious introduction. My name again is Tessie Kuhe, and up until very recently, I was a member of staff with USAID Nigeria. And today I'd like to talk about some of the things that Deanna started us off with, which is that the policy still begins with a gender analysis. There's still very much a focus on conducting gender analyses because really, truly, that's how this work gets operationalized. So I'd like to share some of my findings in the field and some of the things that we put in place to help operationalize this. So like Diana said, what stayed the same about the policy? The fact that the WE Act and the previous gender equality and female empowerment policy required that programs and strategies and activities be shaped by gender analysis along the program cycle. Now, this didn't change. However, like Diana said, the previous policies both required mandated gender analyses at the program or the project level or at the strategic level, and did not necessarily require analyses at the activity level. And this was a problem. This was a major challenge in terms of operationalizing the policy and getting gender analyses conducted at the activity level to drive implementation. So there seemed to be a disconnect between what was happening at a project level, at a strategic level, versus what was happening at the activity level, because these issues were not cascaded down all the way into activities in several instances. What changed with the policy, with the updated policy, was like Diana said, that this requirement to conduct gender analysis was clarified. In the previous instances, there were several times when one had to argue back and forth, should we do gender analysis at the activity level? Are they required or not? That was clearly clarified in the updated version. So people knew at what level gender analysis were to be conducted, who was to conduct them, and what they were to be used for, what the information was to be used for after they had been conducted. So clarity in terms of gender analysis was one of the things that changed. So in terms of previous practice, activity level gender analysis were not mandatory, but in practice, most of those who were conducted were routinely being conducted post-award. They were being conducted by implementing partners at the implementation stage. They were not necessarily budgeted for either at the project or activity or even strategic level. They were not considered necessarily when programs were designing the activity monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan, or the staffing plan, or the budget. And they were not considered intentionally in work planning or even in reporting. Gender was not necessarily considered in terms of work planning and in reporting. And the conduct of gender analysis, many times I heard things like, I have no budget to do this gender analysis. Who's going to fund it? So the current practice now is that they are mandatory at the activity design stage, which is incredibly wonderful because they provide that opportunity for the emission to address some of the challenges we found at implementation, which were that there was no gender action plan. There was no budget to conduct a gender analysis. There was nothing in the procurement itself, in the instructions to offer us, or in the grading plan for any proposal. So these were some of the things that are now being addressed in practice. So if you conduct a gender analysis at the design stage, you're forced to integrate the findings and recommendations into the statement of work objectives, the program description, the sample M&E plan, the sample indicators, stuff like that, and to put it in the grading system for whatever that our procurement is. So this really has helped to identify indicators, identify staffing, budget clarity in procurement in practices. Some of the adaptive pivots that missions have done have also shaped how these analyses are being conducted. One thing I must share is that at the mission level, time poverty is a very real challenge. Staff are charged with doing several things, including gender, localization, conflict, several things at the same time. Like Diana alluded to, several instances, it is the same person who's responsible for all or many of these overlapping activities. So there have often not been uh, an opportunity for staff to do these analyses with fidelity. So what we've done in terms of with fidelity to the original intention, which is that an activity is shaped by the analysis. So what we have done as a mission is to have, or as missions, I've discovered more than just my former mission, is that several missions have created an opportunity for rapid analysis to be conducted. The agency has also provided tools for this. And I've also created an opportunity for the intentional programming to include other key areas, key priorities of the agency, and I'll speak to that soon, including people with disabilities, inclusive development, youth, and so on in a gender analysis. So the challenges that we've had was that the previous practice that IPs conducted analysis was good in that they were able to program off of them in a work plan, for example. But now, with staff conducting analysis, like I mentioned, time poverty is real. They are often very abridged. They don't have sufficient detail to drive implementation. There's also concern about the quality of gender analysis being conducted by staff. They are not consistently following a similar pattern, reviewing similar types of data, and this is a challenge. So one of the things that we have done is to create solutions such as to develop tools, to create an opportunity for both staff and implementing partners to participate in the agenda analysis. So you do a gender analysis at the design stage, and the partner does a supplementary analysis post-award so that they can get more information to be able to do the programming. So key lessons, as I round up, is that gender analysis have been re-emphasized in this iteration of the policy as a good development practice. Tools and capacity building have been developed to support the practice of gender analysis. And in practice, opportunities exist for both USAID and implementing staff to practice, identifying and framing the gender issues around an activity in the spaces where USAID is working and where other partners are also working. And a key lesson for us all is that dynamism in operationalizing the policy is key. And is context specific. Collaboration with DEI councils, with inclusive development and localization efforts have helped massively to address intersectionality in a way that only a focus on gender work would not necessarily have been able to achieve at the mission. Intersectionality, integration, transformative programming, and then collaboration across sectors and across several marginalization issues. And with that, I'm just going to say thank you for listening. If you have any questions for me, I'll take them later. Over.
Thank you so much, Tessie. We really appreciate that closer look at the gender analysis. Let's go to Carolini for her presentation on intersectionality.
All right, good morning, everyone. I have 6 minutes to give you an example of how we incorporated intersectionality at the mission. While we wait for it to come up. Next slide, please. So to give you some context, Colombia is a mission based in South America. In the two maps in the middle, you can see that we have a high concentration of Afro-Colombians along the Pacific coast of the country, as well as indigenous population along the Pacific and also in the Amazon region. And the program that we're going to highlight today is called Generating Equity, and they're focused in the areas that you can see in red and blue on the map to your right. And there's significant overlap where we can find Afro-Colombian and indigenous populations in the country. Next slide, please. Also, in this context, it's really important to note that we did a study on social institutional tolerance of violence against women. And this study found that although in the country there was about 1 in 3 women were survivors of GBV, like we see across the globe, specifically among Afro-Colombian and indigenous women, the survivors, the prevalence of GBV was much higher. So it was really important for us to go back, please. So it was really important for us to work with that community specifically and address why Afro-Colombian and indigenous women were disproportionately survivors of GBV. It was the next slide. There we go. We also realized that the most common type of GBV was psychological violence. This was invisible forms of GBV that were often normalized and not considered violence among the populations. And it was really worrisome that we found that public servants generally agreed that violence against indigenous and Afro-Colombian women was part of their culture. So it was really an attitude of, oh, there's nothing we can do about this. So considering this context, we knew that we needed a specific strategy focused on indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities that had an intersection between gender and ethnicity specifically. But we also found that working with men and boys in this context was particularly challenging. So we work with men and boys in areas where GBV is highly normalized, as I mentioned before. And if you work with men using a traditional gender programming, they may feel attacked or targeted by this programming, and that will push them away instead of bringing them in as allies. And also, it was important to note that men from these communities, they often face themselves different forms of oppression and feel the effects of racism against them. So it's important to consider the context of oppression that we're working in and the different dynamics of power. Next slide, please. So we decided to use an anti-racist approach. And for us, that means it's an approach that seeks to transform the power relations that subordinate certain populations, as well as create spaces of power for people in these societies who might have been considered inferior, lacking, subhuman, or marginalized. Next slide. And it's really important to think about when we're doing gender transformative programming. We're trying to identify and address gender inequalities and their structural root causes. Similarly, when we're doing anti-racist programming, we want to identify and address racism and its multiple manifestations from microaggressions to systemic inequalities and their structural root causes. So there's a big overlap between these two approaches when we want to do intersectional work that considers both gender and ethnicity. We need to address these unequal power relations as the core of our intersectional approach. This approach needs to be intentional from the beginning, designed into the implementation. It needs to be active, so it's not something that can passively happen. It needs to be participatory, so you have to work with the communities where you're implementing the programming in order to design these initiatives. And obviously, it has to be culturally relevant for both the gender transformative and our anti-racist approach. So there really is a lot of similarities between these two if it's done intentionally from the beginning. Next. So what did we do? Obviously, I can't go into much detail, but it was really key here that we had an extensive co-creation process. So we identified the priorities of local feminist movements. So even though we were targeting men and boys, we really focused on hearing what is it that women need in these spaces and targeting the agenda around women's needs. We provided the women's organizations technical training. That way they could develop their own interventions, which we obviously supported. Here, there are 3 experiences that were part of this process. The first one was with a local partner called Afrimukpas. which is a women's organization of council members. So these are Indigenous and Afro-Colombian territories. They have their own governance systems and their own community councils. So this organization, AFRIMIPAS, consists of the women on those councils. And they prioritize working with men and boys to address unequal distribution of unpaid caregiving and GBV. Because these are women leaders, they found that the unequal burden of caregiving was really holding them back from their political leadership in their communities. The second experience was with an autonomous Indigenous university and a local Indigenous authority, and they decided to prioritize GBV and LGBT phobia within their territory. For them, it's really important to address different forms of violence that occurred because they thought that this violence brought a disharmony to the community, and that it can contaminate other areas and take away the harmony from the relationships in the communities. And the third experience was with a university because we realized through the first two that we didn't have enough capacity among local facilitators to work with men and boys in these territories. So we decided to build a pool of men who could be facilitators for gender transformative and anti-racist programming. Next slide, please. So during this, we identified some best practices. So the first one was to use incentives beyond gender equity. So really what got people in the room, maybe something as simple as offering the workshops in a space that has air conditioning. These are really hot spaces. So having air conditioning was a draw-in, especially because of the time of the sessions. We also validated, for example, high school community service hours. We had snacks, and these may seem like silly things, but it really helped to bring people in the communities. The logistics and the schedules were adapted to participants' needs. So in addition to the air conditioning, these are communities that have really heavy agricultural work in the morning or work in the household in the mornings, preparing lunch, getting kids off to school, etc. The afternoon is too hot to work. And so that's a time where people were often in their homes, and we were able to work with them in these air-conditioned, comfortable spaces during that time. Because in the evening or late afternoon, they would be back to work. So we had to find these gaps of time where people were available. Obviously, context-relevant content. So the materials, the videos, everything had to look like the people we were working in, had to be co-created with these communities. And we have several examples for those who are interested later I can share with you. And not look like necessarily someone in an urban area, someone from Bogota, which is cold, someone that has, a washing machine in their house, because these are things that were not relevant in that context. It was also important to recognize the worries and the needs and the problems faced by every member of the community, not just the women and girls. So this included working with men to understand the negative impact of these rigid masculinities on them and understanding how they are also impacted by racism and sexism in their communities. And obviously, the last point was that it's important to find charismatic, competent, and dedicated facilitators, which was a big, big challenge in these communities and why we had to kind of develop this pool of facilitators. Next slide, please. So just to conclude this example of how do we apply intersectionality, it was really important to have critical thinking about structures of power related to masculinities. And this also helped men to see how unequal power dynamics are harmful to everyone. So it was much easier to get men in the room to start talking about racism than to start talking about sexism. So it kind of opened the door to talk about power dynamics. Working on masculinities to use using an anti-racist approach meant that we also had to work with the leaderships of the ethnic communities to protect their culture and ancestral knowledge. You can't go in and ignore that they are being threatened culturally as well. And so this had to become part of the programming and part of the discussions as well. And so ultimately, this strategy contributed to the fight for social justice and gender and racial equity in the regions. So it was really impossible to just look at gender when we have this whole context of multiple forms of oppression in the communities where we're working. Next slide, please. And there are some references to what we were talking about for the anti-racist approach if you want to take a look at it later. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for that really powerful example of intersectionality and contextual approaches. I'm so excited that you're each going to have an opportunity now to be in a discussion led by either Tessie or Caroline. So in just a moment, we're going to move into these breakout discussions. And you'll have an opportunity to share your own examples, brainstorm ideas about how you might further engage in programming that aligns with the policy, ask questions, just really be in dialogue and sharing with one another. So Malvika is going to be randomly assigning each one of you to the discussions. We're going to spend 15 minutes in those small groups, come back together at the top of the hour to discuss some of the takeaways in the plenary, so you'll have an opportunity to hear what emerges from both of the breakout discussions. So let's head over there as soon as you're ready, Malvika.
We'll see excited about